And everybody cheered and they went crazy. And then about a half an hour later, black smoke came out. That never in history has that happened, that the white smoke came out.
What if I told you that The Passion of the Christ didn't just dominate the box office, but seemed to rip open the boundary between this world and something darker? Storm struck without warning. Actors collapsed mid-scene, all wrapped in a silence that still endures to this day. This is the hidden story of what happened when Mel Gibson crossed a line that perhaps should never have been crossed. Stay with us, because what you're about to see may change everything you thought you knew about this film. The breaking point that changed everything. For nearly 20 years, Mel Gibson said almost nothing about what truly happened behind the scenes of The Passion of the Christ. Not during the press storm, not after the box office explosion, not even when the controversies nearly destroyed his career.
You know, to be perfectly honest, the first thing I thought of.
But when asked in a private interview what really happened, he gave just one sentence. To this day, no one can explain it. Those words weren't from a script. They came from a man who had lived it. A man who poured $45 million of his own money into a film no one wanted him to make. But long before cameras rolled, before the sandstorms and the lightning strikes, before the whispers of a supernatural presence, Gibson was already fighting something darker, himself.
The same kind of stress, when there's a lot more physical, it's all mixed up.
By the late 1990s, his world was collapsing. Alcohol had become his constant companion, turning triumphs into hollow victories. He confessed later that suicide felt like a real option. This wasn't the kind of stumble Hollywood loves to turn into a neat redemption arc. This was a man at rock bottom, trapped in despair, addiction, and guilt, far from the Catholic roots of his childhood. Then one night, it all broke. Alone, Gibson fell to his knees, not with a script, not with ceremony, but with desperation. He would later describe that moment as an encounter with God so overwhelming it burned through him like fire. It forced him to see his sins as if they were nails driven into Christ's hands. From that night forward, everything changed. He became consumed. Scripture that once felt distant now seemed alive, urgent. He studied the Gospels obsessively, then moved deeper into accounts of Roman brutality, ancient descriptions of crucifixion, and the haunting visions of the nun Anne Catherine Emmerich, who claimed to have witnessed Christ's final hours in terrifying detail. Her images of dirt, blood, and agony gripped him until they became an obsession.
What's the difference between pre-Vatican II? So Vatican II happened, and of course they took the church and they reformed it.
In that obsession, the seed of an idea took hold. The last 12 hours of Christ's life, told with unflinching authenticity, filmed in the ancient languages, and shown with the brutality Hollywood had never dared to touch. For Gibson, it wasn't a choice. It was a calling. He would make the film, even if it meant filming in ancient languages, even if it meant showing the brutality in ways Hollywood had never dared. He was convinced anything less would betray the truth that had pulled him from the edge of despair. But the industry did not share his conviction, and the moment he revealed what he intended to create, the backlash began. The film Hollywood refused to touch. When Mel Gibson finally revealed what he wanted to create, the reaction inside Hollywood boardrooms was instant, and it was fear. Executives were skeptical and unsettled. This was not the Jesus story they knew how to market, and what Gibson described left them convinced they were staring at commercial disaster.
You're making this film, and the idea was that we're all responsible for this, that his sacrifice.
His pitch was simple, but uncompromising. He wanted to show the crucifixion exactly as it happened, with nothing softened for comfort. There would be no sweeping music to ease the violence, no polished images of a saintly figure inspiring forgiveness. The story would unfold in raw detail, the betrayal, the suffering, the brutality, spoken in the original languages of the time, Aramaic, Latin, and Hebrew. Subtitles would be an afterthought. Gibson wanted audiences to feel the weight of the emotions without translation, to strain against the words and absorb the pain through the sounds alone. The response was brutal. At first, there was silence, then nervous laughter. Studio heads shifted in their chairs, glancing at spreadsheets that told them everything they needed to know. This was not a family-friendly religious drama they could sell at Easter. This was a bloody, R-rated account of suffering that they were sure would empty theaters before the story even reached its climax. They dismissed it with one phrase, Each rejection only sharpened Gibson's determination. While executives whispered that he had lost his mind, Gibson kept working. His notes filled notebooks and napkins with sketches, scenes, and historical details pulled from ancient texts and eyewitness accounts. He was determined that every frame would immerse viewers in the reality of Roman cruelty, where crucifixion was not swift justice, but a slow, public torment, designed to strip away humanity. The industry might have turned him away, but Gibson refused to back down. Instead, he made a decision that few believed he would follow through on. He pulled $30 million from his own fortune to finance the film himself, then committed another $15 million for marketing. There and then, he became a man willing to risk everything he had built on one story. It was a gamble that could have destroyed him. If the project failed, Gibson would not only lose money, he would lose credibility and perhaps his career. But he believed it was more than a film. It was a calling, and he was willing to stake everything on it. And the moment he began casting, that gamble grew even stranger. The casting that felt like a prophecy. The strangest part wasn't just Gibson's idea for the film. It was who he chose to bring it to life. From the beginning, he refused to cast stars. He didn't want to involve familiar faces or marquee names. In his eyes, a Hollywood celebrity stepping into the role of Jesus would turn a sacred story into a spectacle, their fame swallowing the message before a single line was spoken. Instead, Gibson went searching in the margins. He wanted actors unknown enough to disappear into history's shadows, men and women who could carry the weight of ancient voices without dragging modern scandals or gossip along with them. That was when a quiet actor named Jim Caviezel appeared on his radar. Caviezel had been circling the industry for years, never breaking through. You might have spotted him in the thin red line or frequency, but always on the edges, never at the center. What caught Gibson wasn't his resume, it was his eyes. Caviezel had a stillness, an intensity, as if he were holding back something larger than himself. Gibson saw it, and for the first time, paused. The meeting that followed was unlike a standard audition. Gibson laid the script in front of Caviezel and warned him plainly, this role could end his career. No one in Hollywood wanted this film made, and anyone who tied themselves to it risked being blacklisted. "You'll never work in this town again," Gibson said. Caviezel didn't withdraw. He didn't negotiate. He simply met Gibson's gaze and replied, "We all have to embrace our crosses." The words hung in the air, chilling in their weight, as if rehearsed by something larger than chance. And then, the details started stacking up in ways too strange to ignore. Caviezel's initials, JC, mirrored the very figure he was about to portray. He was 33 years old, the same age as Jesus at the crucifixion. Coincidences, yes, but they hit like signs. Once Caviezel was chosen, Gibson built the rest of the cast from the same cloth. Unknowns, chosen for their faces, their presence, their ability to vanish into roles bigger than themselves. Luca Lionello, who would play Judas, was another, picked not for fame, but for the sharp, unsettling features that made betrayal believable. But as rehearsals began, something unsettling crept in. Cast members whispered about the strange energy surrounding the production. Table reads carried a weight that felt heavier than fiction. The more they stepped into their roles, the more it seemed the film was pulling them into something far beyond acting. And that unease only deepened when they arrived at the place where the cameras would roll. Hit the like button if you're starting to see how this casting felt less like a coincidence and more like a prophecy unfolding. Matera, the town that wouldn't stay silent. From the moment the crew stepped onto the setting, unease settled in. The stone walls, the caves carved deep into the hillside, and the silence that seemed to press in from every direction didn't feel like a film location. It felt like something alive, something watching, something that had been waiting for them. This was Matera, a town so old it looked less built than unearthed, its weight of centuries hanging heavy enough to choke the air. Gibson chose Matera for one reason: authenticity. He refused to rely on green screens or studio trickery. He wanted real stone, real dust, and a landscape that looked as if it had witnessed scripture itself. The town's age and silence gave it exactly that. But authenticity came with a cost. Moving equipment through Matera's twisting roads was grueling. Locals watched quietly from their doorways as trucks struggled up the hills, their stares unreadable. The crew brushed it off as curiosity, but attention hung in the air, heavy enough to notice. On the outskirts, Gibson ordered the construction of Golgotha. Wooden crosses rose against the horizon. Pathways were carved into the earth, and tools forged to look centuries old clattered under the sun. He demanded everything look and feel real, down to the grit in the actor's eyes. And that's when the first signs began. Clear mornings suddenly darkened into purple skies by noon. Crew members stopped mid-task, unsettled by the shift. Some reported sudden dizziness. Others broke into tears for no reason at all. Even seasoned professionals, hardened by years of tough shoots, admitted they felt as though something was pressing in on them. It didn't stop there. Strange drafts seemed to sigh from the caves, carrying scents that shouldn't have been there: iron, incense, and something faintly bitter. Workers joked at first, but soon they began to glance over their shoulders, uneasy at the thought of being watched. Even Gibson, usually unshakable on set, was not immune. The cast and crew caught him breaking from his usual intensity, wandering off alone, kneeling in the dust to pray. His sharp commands softened to whispers, as if he sensed that Matera wasn't just a backdrop, but something alive, something listening. What might have been dismissed as nerves or exhaustion built into something harder to ignore. The weather turned unpredictable, storms gathering out of nowhere, striking with a force and timing that rattled even the most skeptical. And just when the cast and crew thought the worst had passed, Matera showed them it had only just begun to push back, when lightning struck twice. The first signs that something was wrong came not from the ground, but from the skies. What began as clear mornings would collapse into sudden storms, as if the weather was waiting for the cameras to roll before it turned hostile. By the time filming settled into rhythm, the crew realized this wasn't a coincidence. Dawn would break calm, but as soon as scenes of betrayal, agony, or prayer began, clouds would gather without warning, and moments later, the skies would clear again, as if nothing had happened. Meteorologists later admitted the logs didn't add up. Gusts spiked at precise moments in the script, when Christ begged for deliverance, when soldiers mocked him, when silence followed a plea to heaven. It wasn't random, it was synchronized, and it unnerved even the skeptics. Then came the strike that seared itself into legend. Cameras were rolling on the crucifixion scene. Jim Caviezel hung on the cross, covered in blood, whispering lines in Aramaic. The sky above was clear. There was no thunder or warning. And then a bolt of lightning ripped down and hit him directly. The crew scattered in panic. Caviezel convulsed violently, his tongue bitten through as his heart lurched into arrhythmia. He survived, but the damage was real.
It happened in the weirdest areas of the movie. There's a piece where Mary...
Months later, doctors would open his chest twice in surgery to repair the rhythm, scars forever marking the impact of that day. Before anyone could process what happened, it struck again. On the very same hill, lightning slammed into assistant director John Michelini, not once, but for the second time during this same production. The odds were beyond calculation, and the whispers grew louder. Some said it was divine wrath. Others called it a curse. What no one could deny was the timing. Clear skies, no storm in sight, and yet Matera had become a lightning rod. After that, the atmosphere on set changed completely. Crew members broke into tears for no reason. Some collapsed with dizziness, and others swore they felt a presence pressing in on them. Even Gibson, normally unshakable, walked the perimeter with a hollow stare, torn between pushing forward and wondering if they had stirred forces they couldn't control. By the end of the day, the hill was no longer just a backdrop. It had turned into a battlefield, and every strike left them questioning whether they were filming a story or living inside one. When fiction drew blood. No one on set expected Jim Caviezel to bleed for real, but before long, the line between acting and agony vanished. What was meant to look brutal started cutting into his flesh, and every take pulled him further from performance into survival. The scourging scenes were supposed to be controlled chaos. Layers of prosthetics covered his back, while whips were rigged with soft barbs designed to miss skin. But during one take, the wind shifted, and a single strike went off course. The barb tore a 14-inch gash across his back, ripping into muscle. Caviezel buckled, blood soaking through the prosthetics. Yet he stayed in character, groaning through the real pain while the cameras rolled. Medics rushed in, stitched him up under the open sky, and the scar stayed as proof that this role was no longer make-believe. Then came the cross, a massive beam of rough-hewn wood, weighing more than 100 pounds, had to be dragged over and over again for the Via Dolorosa sequence. On one take, Caviezel's foot caught in a divot. The beam yanked his arm back, dislocating his shoulder with a sickening crack that echoed across the set. He collapsed. His ribs rattled, but he hauled himself up without calling for a double. The screams in the final cut weren't rehearsed. They came from the raw shock of bones and tendons failing under the weight. The suffering didn't stop there. During night shoots in Matera, temperatures dropped dangerously low. Caviezel hung on the cross for hours, shivering violently as hypothermia set in. His body shook so hard that even the makeup team admitted they couldn't tell which bruises were painted and which were real.
The greatest pain I ever felt on that film, even more than the hyperthermia.
By the third week, he had lost over 40 pounds, his face hollowed and ribs protruding. The crew whispered about the toll it was taking, watching him push himself deeper into the role while his health broke down. Accidents piled up like omens. A chain-link weapon cut his thigh during a mock fight. A slip on the blood-slick floor reopened his shoulder wound. He fasted, barely slept, and withdrew into his trailer, speaking lines to himself as though the role had consumed him. The set grew uneasy. This wasn't just acting anymore. It was something darker, as though the suffering was demanding payment in flesh. And it wasn't only Caviezel. Gibson felt it too, pacing the edges of the set with his Bible in hand, muttering verses like a man haunted. Both director and actor seemed bound by an unspoken pact that the pain itself was part of the film. Crew members who had come for a job left shaken, some claiming they felt something spiritual stirring through the ordeal. What played out on camera wasn't fiction bleeding into reality, it was reality carving itself into the film. Share this with a friend who thinks they know what it means to suffer for a role, because what happened here went far beyond acting. The conversions no one expected. It wasn't just Caviezel who walked away changed. Strange things began happening on set, moments too personal, too unsettling to pass off as a coincidence. What started as a film shoot slowly shifted into something else, and the crew felt it pressing in. The first to break was Luca Lionello, the actor playing Judas. He had no interest in faith, mocking religion most of his life. But during the betrayal scenes, something began gnawing at him. He woke from nightmares of shadowy figures circling him, drenched in sweat, his chest tightening like the role had followed him into his sleep. Soon, fevers came and stayed, doctors finding no clear cause. Weeks of exhaustion pushed him to the edge, until finally, he walked into a chapel near the set and asked to be baptized. He carried a Bible from that day on, calling it protection, and admitted years later that the film forced him to confront something he couldn't explain. His wasn't the only shift. Crew members who showed up for a paycheck began carrying Bibles around the set. Extras slipped away at night for hurried baptisms in Matera's ancient churches. Between takes, grips, and lighting techs were seen kneeling in the dirt, praying quietly as though the set itself demanded reverence. The hill where the crucifixion was filmed became less a workplace and more a shrine. Others weren't so willing to talk about what they saw. One prop wrangler admitted he kept catching glimpses of robed figures flickering at the edge of his vision, gone when he blinked. A sound technician broke down in tears during setup after hearing lines about denial, confessing sins he'd hidden for years. And then there were the editors. When footage came in, they noticed faces in crowd scenes no one remembered filming, shadows falling wrong, like someone, or something, had stepped into the frame uninvited. Not everyone stayed. Some crew members simply walked off mid-production and never returned, refusing to explain. Even years later, they refused interviews, claiming silence was safer. Whispers spread about a pact of hush among those who stayed, as though speaking of what happened would call it back. Director Mel Gibson leaned into it. He walked the set at dawn with a Bible in hand, muttering prayers, sometimes falling to his knees in the open. The more the strange events mounted, the more his faith turned fervent, pulling others into late-night arguments about whether they were witnessing devotion or warfare. By the end, the set didn't feel like a film shoot. It felt like a crossroads, something sacred and dangerous, cracking open lives in ways no one had signed up for. The premiere that divided the world. What happened on set was unsettling, but no one was prepared for what followed once the film was unleashed. When The Passion of the Christ premiered on Ash Wednesday, February 25, 2004, the world didn't just watch, it reacted. Mel Gibson avoided the usual Hollywood machine. There were no red carpets or glossy campaigns. Instead, he showed the film to pastors in church basements, letting word of mouth spread through congregations. Soon, churches were renting out entire theaters. Buses brought in worshipers, and lobby spaces turned into prayer circles. This wasn't a movie premiere. It became a movement. The gamble worked. On its opening day, the film pulled in $23.5 million, climbing to $83.8 million by the end of its first weekend. By the time it finished its run, it had earned $370 million in the United States and more than $611 million worldwide, making it the highest-grossing R-rated movie ever. For many, it wasn't just cinema. It was a spiritual experience. There were reports of people leaving wheelchairs behind, sudden conversions, and crowds in tears long after the credits ended. But the success came with a cost. Jewish groups, including the Anti-Defamation League, accused the film of fueling anti-Semitism, pointing to its portrayal of the mob demanding Christ's crucifixion. Gibson pushed back, insisting he was following Scripture, but the debate raged in headlines, interviews, and even on the floors of Congress. What was meant as devotion was, to others, a dangerous spark. The violence on screen also stirred controversy. Critics blasted the prolonged scourging scene as one of the most brutal ever filmed. Some audience members fainted, others left theaters shaken, and hospitals even reported spikes in emergency calls on screening nights. The film blurred the line between depiction and torment, forcing viewers to endure suffering as much as watch it. The global response was fractured. Catholic nations like Mexico and Italy embraced the film, treating it as reverent and transformative. But in places like France and Germany, it was denounced as excessive and inflammatory, accused of reigniting old religious wounds. Dinner tables, talk shows, and news panels erupted with the same division. Was it a masterpiece of faith or a spectacle of cruelty? What no one could deny was its impact. The Passion of the Christ didn't just premiere, it detonated, drawing millions into its orbit and leaving behind a trail of faith, fury, and fear. And for Gibson, the storm had only just begun. The curse that followed them home. Some on set believed the storm would end when the cameras stopped, but what came after felt worse. It was as if whatever had been stirred up in Matera refused to stay behind, shadowing the cast and crew long after the final cut. Jim Caviezel thought his role would open doors. His performance drew praise from pulpits and critics alike. Yet, the calls stopped almost immediately. Major roles disappeared, casting directors turned away, and soon he was branded too controversial. One studio executive allegedly muttered, "You played Christ. Now this town is crucifying you for it." The offers that did come were mostly from faith-based projects, far from the mainstream career he'd been building. Caviezel accepted it without public bitterness, often saying the silence was part of his calling. But privately, the exile weighed heavily. Mel Gibson's fall was far more public. In 2006, just 2 years after the film's release, he was arrested for DUI and launched into a drunken anti-Semitic tirade that dominated headlines. Overnight, the man who had directed the highest-grossing R-rated movie of all time became a pariah. Soon after came leaked recordings of his violent rants and private breakdowns, each one erasing the goodwill he had built from Braveheart and The Passion. To many, it looked less like bad luck and more like a curse unraveling in plain sight. The timing was too sharp, too sudden, too tied to the shadow of the film. Gibson himself stayed cagey. For years, he deflected questions with brief nods about God's presence. But in a private interview, his guard slipped. He leaned forward, eyes hollow, and said just 7 words. To this day, no one can explain it. Then he fell silent, leaving only the weight of that unfinished thought.
Moses goes up on the mountain, he comes back down, people are worshiping a golden calf.
Yeah.
You know, it's that.
Whatever haunted the Passion of the Christ didn't fade with its success. For some, it looked like divine favor. For others, like payback. And for all of them, it never truly let go. The secret that refuses to die. From the start, The Passion of the Christ never felt like just another movie. And 2 decades later, that feeling has only deepened. 21 years on, it is still surrounded by silence and scars that no interview or press release has ever fully explained. Something was crossed out there, and not everyone has been willing to speak about what they found on the other side. The film reshaped Hollywood, proving that audiences craved something raw, resolute, and deeply spiritual. It became a cultural earthquake that earned staggering numbers and left millions shaken. But the stories whispered since then, the strange events, the unspoken vows of silence from the crew, hint that it was more than a groundbreaking production. It was a crucible where art and faith collided with something beyond either. And that silence, even now, is the loudest detail of all. Too many who were there refused to revisit it, as if speaking openly would carry a cost. Too many unexplained moments remain sealed, as though they were never meant for public eyes. So here we are, more than 20 years later, and one question still looms. Was this only a film? Or did Gibson and his crew open a door that can never be shut? What do you think really happened on that set? Were these just coincidences? Or did they brush against something far beyond human understanding? Share your thoughts in the comments section below. And if you're ready to keep chasing the stories Hollywood would rather keep buried, subscribe now, because the next secret is even darker. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.